not done a whole lot. Those people that did not support slavery would have certainly been in a minority. And they also attacked slavery a little bit differently than how people will start attacking slavery by the mid 19th century. So we first want to look at kind of what the earlier abolitionists, the early abolition movement kind of looked like and sounded like, because that will help us to understand how it transforms and how it starts to take on a much different tone as a result of the Second Great Awakening. Most early opposition to slavery, and granted, early opposition to slavery was incredibly minimal. Even the abolition movement, when it starts to grow, we're going to talk about it growing, even then, it's always going to be a minority movement. It will always be something that not the majority of people would have supported. So certainly in the early days, and I'm talking colonial days and days of the early republic, this would have been a very small number of people, but they typically used a different kind of approach. Most of your early abolitionists would have supported something called gradualism. Now, gradualism, using that word gradual, what does it mean if something is gradual?
It's slow.
Slow, so done over a period of time. So gradualism was the idea that slavery should be, phased out, that it should be a gradual process, that it should be gradually eliminated over a period of time. So in other words, don't go in and just completely get rid of it all at once, but we sort of phase it out. And this was the approach that a lot of, you probably remember how, or hopefully remember how we talked about after the Revolution, some states, northern states, started the process of abolishing slavery. Many of them used a gradual approach. They didn't do it all at one time. They sort of phased it out. Like, for example, they might have said, slavery we'll be rid of it in like 20 or 30 years, or from this point forward, the children of slaves will be free, or from this point forward, people have to start emancipating their slaves, and it has to be done within the next decade or something like that. So it's a gradual, over time kind of process, and that was what a lot of them thought was best, and that's what a lot of northern states that had allowed slavery in the colonial years start to use. Many of your early abolitionists and people or abolitionist programs, policies toward abolition, may have also supported compensation. And these are not competing ideas. These two things could go in conjunction with each other. What does it mean if someone gets compensated for something?
They
Get paid for it. So compensation was the concept that slave owners who are freeing slaves should be compensated for them. In other words, they should get paid. So if the slave owner is going to free his slaves or stop practicing slavery, then they should be paid for that, reimbursed, basically, the value of that lost property. And that approach was used in several northern states. In several of them where they did start outlawing slavery, they may have used a gradual approach, and they may have also offered compensation as a means of compensating, obviously, slave owners for that financial loss. So you can see how later people will question that, and when we get to these newer abolitionists, that's one of the things that they'll be very much opposed to. Saying that slavery you shouldn't be paid for it if it's wrong to begin with, and why are people being paid for that loss? Let me fix this so you can actually see this word. Move that over. There we go. Okay, so again, gradualism and compensation are not necessarily competing ideas. A lot of them times it could go together. Another idea that was circulated around that was, I won't say hugely popular because it wasn't, but it was another idea regarding early abolition, was the idea called colonization, or the support of a colonization movement. Groups such as the American Colonization Society would have proposed this. This was a group that suggested colonization and that encouraged colonization. Now, what this had to do with was not so much abolishing slavery, but more about what happens after you abolish slavery. Those that supported colonization operated from a belief that once African Americans were freed, and if they were freed, that they should not stay in the United States. That the United States should stay a single race country, or should be a single race country, let's put it that way. And so they didn't think that African Americans should be should stay in the United States once they were free, that they should be recolonized, in other words, relocated somewhere else. That there should be colonies formed for which African Americans, free African Americans, could go, so that they wouldn't be in the United States anymore. And usually that meant back to Africa. So colonization movement was really a movement to relocate free people to colonies in Africa. Now, there's two kind of ways to look at it, and people might have approached this different ways. Some people, obviously, there's it's an incredibly racist, idea that the United States should be a single race country and that free African Americans should not be integrated into society, that sort of thing. And so they should be relocated somewhere else. They, however, would have taken a very benevolent tone with this and would have phrased this as African Americans will never get full rights here. Their life won't be good, so they'd be better off and they'd be a lot happier if they go somewhere else. And if they go to these colonies in Africa, they'll be around people that are like them. They'll be able to have more control over their lives. They'll be able to be more free if they're somewhere else. So while they put this sort of positive spin on it, there's no way of getting around it. It's an incredibly racist idea, but not an uncommon one for the time, for sure. So there were attempts, and groups like the American Colonization Society, they tried to raise money and things like that to not only encourage it, but to try to support anyone, African Americans that may have wanted to be colonized, and there were thousands that were. It was a voluntary thing, so it's not like they were forcing people, but still their belief was that African Americans couldn't or shouldn't be integrated into American society. Liberia is an example of such a colony. So Liberia was a colony set up in West Africa as a means of colonizing former slaves, set up by the United States for that purpose. Even the name Liberia means something. What does that kind of look like? Liberty, which means freedom. And that's an independent country today, the capital of which is called Monrovia. What do you think that's named for? President Monroe. However, colonization, as you can imagine, it's not ever all that successful because, for one, it's quite expensive. There's a lot of money involved in this, in sending people to Africa and starting up colonies and all these sorts of things. That's part of what the American Colonization Society tried to do, is raise funding for it. So it's quite an expensive thing. But the other big roadblock here is that most free African Americans weren't interested in it. Most of them didn't want to go to Africa. They were several generations removed from that, and they had no interest in relocating and didn't see that, as being the best option for them. So while it was supported by some groups and some people saw that as kind of a condition, or might have offered it as a condition for abolition, it never is a mainstream idea, and it is never used all that much because of the expense and because, of course, of the opposition to it from a lot of freed people. Now, all of these ideas, you'll notice, and they're not conflicting ideas. Someone could have believed in all three of these, that, hey, we need to approach this gradually, do it over time, compensate slave owners, and colonize people somewhere else that once they are free. There were people that thought all three of these things were the answer. But you'll also notice that all of these don't address at all slavery as a moral issue. It is more of slavery being an economic issue, and that is what early opposition to slavery tended to focus on. They tend to stay away from attacks on slavery as being wrong, and it is more slavery is just not a very good labor system. It's expensive. It is threatening to free white labor. That is just, it's not sustainable, and that it's not modern, that it's outdated. They tend to focus more on those things rather than attacking it morally. You would have been pretty hard-pressed to find certainly a whole lot of white Americans that would have been speaking out against slavery on moral grounds. Well, that starts to change in the 1830s and then moving on, to the 1850s and so forth, as the abolitionist movement kind of gets a new sort of a new message to it. It sort of transforms, and we get this, what becomes called kind of the new abolition. Again, abolition is not an old idea, but it starts to transform. It takes on a much different tone, a much different message, and it starts to become much more, some people would have considered radical. Now there are, abolition, like any kind of a movement, is a spectrum thing. There are people that, they all kind of believe in the same thing, but some might be more extreme than others. But for a lot of people, they would see the abolitionist movement started to become far more vocal and perhaps more radical as a result, partially, of the Second Great Awakening. So the Second Great Awakening, as we talked about yesterday, it influences a lot of reform movements. But one of them is abolition, because a lot of people, as they became more religiously convicted, they started to see slavery as a sin. They started to see slavery as sinful, as wrong, as not just something that was economically backwards and not just something that was economically unsustainable, but as something that was harmful, as something that was cruel, as something that was oppressive, as something that was offensive to God, and something that could not be tolerated, and something that the United States could not allow, or else that it was just, crushing and damaging the very soul of the United States to allow slavery. So they start to attack it more on a moral basis, and less on an economic basis, although that is part of it. So starting to see it more as something that was unchristian, undemocratic, and that could no longer be tolerated. There are multiple abolitionists that are part of this new abolition phase. There are, again, many of them. We're just going to talk about a few of the big ones. Probably one of the leading voices, and certainly the most radical of these voices of this new abolition, and one that gets more and more and more radical as time goes on, is William Lloyd Garrison, who's pictured here. William Lloyd Garrison was obviously an abolitionist. He is, and a lot of these newer abolitionists were, but he kind of becomes the face for it because he is so vocal and becomes so well known. He is what you would call an immediate abolitionist, arguing for immediate abolition. What do you think that means?
Just like
Right now, yeah, immediate. He rejects, as a lot of these newer abolitionists do, rejecting the idea of gradualism, rejecting compensation, saying this has to end right now. That this is wrong, it is immoral, it is a sin, that slave owners will be punished by God, the whole country is going to face the wrath of God if we do not stop this today. Garrison was also, again, I say he's more radical, and he becomes more radical as he goes along. Basically arguing, doesn't matter if it's legal, it doesn't matter if it's economically necessary, it doesn't matter if the Constitution protects it, and that makes the Constitution wrong. He, raises a lot of eyebrows when, so he did a public demonstration where he set the Constitution on fire and said, if this allows slavery, then it makes it wrong, and the country is evil for allowing it, and so forth. He publishes a newspaper beginning about the 1830s or so, called Liberator. So that's his newspaper that he publishes. And so we start to see more abolitionist literature being circulated around, publishing articles and so forth, urging people to stop slavery and urging slave owners to free their slaves and all these sorts of things. But again, he's pretty radical. And also Garrison's a bit different and maybe a bit more extreme, and that he's not, and this was not true of all these abolitionists, it's true of a lot of them, I guess, but Garrison was very much not only in favor of ending slavery, but believed in full equality of African Americans, which a lot of abolitionists didn't go that far, and they might have said slavery was wrong, but that African Americans shouldn't receive full rights and all that kind of stuff, whereas Garrison did. Garrison really saw no difference. And believed that, you had to end slavery, but that African Americans should be fully included in every aspect of society and so forth. So he was pretty extreme on that level. Eventually, even other abolitionists start distancing themselves from Garrison because he could get, pretty extreme as time goes on, eventually even advocating, or at least not denouncing, the use of violence if necessary, and that's not really until we're getting close to Civil War anyway, but he gets more and more frustrated with the lack of progress. So William Lloyd Garrison becomes one of the leading voices, and obviously you notice Garrison is a white man, and we see more white abolitionists during this period. Although it's certainly not just a white movement, and it certainly would not have been successful without African American voices as well. So that's the interesting thing about the abolition movement. Another way that it's changing in this period is it's becoming far more diverse, and that it's not just one particular kind of people that are supporting it. You have white people like Garrison. You have African American abolitionists, some that had always been free, some that were not, and a large inclusion of women. Like we see in a lot of the reform movements, but the abolition movement does involve a lot of women. And as far as African American abolitionists, certainly the most famous and the most well known of all the African American abolitionists, it's probably a familiar name to many of you, probably the most famous African American for his time, was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a former slave. He had been born a slave and lived the first part of his life as a slave, had run away from slavery and escaped. He was a very well-spoken and educated person. He'd been taught to read by a former owner and continues his education, and then takes up the fight for abolition. He also writes the paper, the North Star, is his paper that he publishes. So he again becomes one of the leading African American voices for abolition. He and Garrison worked together on many things. They knew each other. So again, it's becoming a more diverse movement as well as becoming a louder one. But Douglass, having experience of slavery, has that firsthand account, whereas Garrison, he's seen things, but Garrison was from the North. He was not from a slaveholding family. He wasn't from slaveholding states. He had seen some things, yes, but Douglass can bring that personal story and that personal narrative and say about the horrors of slavery, which was something that a lot of folks didn't want to hear, a lot of folks didn't want to talk about, something that Southern slave owners certainly wanted to keep under wraps and didn't want people to know, didn't want people to realize. So he's able to bring those experiences to the conversation about abolition. Another abolitionist that was also a former slave that could also bring forth those concepts was Sojourner Truth. Some of you may have heard of Sojourner Truth before. So she was also a former slave. She is more known for her speaking, not as much of a writer. She doesn't publish the way that Garrison and Douglass and several others did. But she traveled the country giving speeches, and not just in favor of abolition, but also women's rights. There is a strong connection, really, and we'll talk more about it in the next couple of days, but there is a strong connection between abolition and women's rights. I mentioned that a lot of abolitionists were female, like Sojourner Truth, as well as many others, both white and black. And they saw a lot of connections there of the situation of people that were voiceless, that were seen as property, that had no rights. A lot of women identified with that in a way, and that causes a lot of them to pursue greater rights for themselves, as well as freedom from slavery. And a lot of these women found themselves restricted. They wanted to support abolition, they wanted to be involved in this movement, and they found themselves, held back because they were women and not allowed to fully participate. And plenty of situations when they were not allowed to speak, or they weren't allowed to be involved, or people didn't listen to them because they were women. And so there's a very strong connection between that. And Sojourner Truth is not the only one that makes that connection and speaks to those things. But once again, the abolition movement is becoming far more vocal. It is starting to attack slavery more on moral grounds, that it was wrong, that it was not just economically bad, and it wasn't just something that was too difficult to keep up forever, but that it was, that it was shameful, and that it was something that had to be dealt with for those reasons. It's becoming a much more diverse movement, and something that, of course, Southerners and slaveholders are going to be reacting sometimes quite violently to. So what we'll be looking at in a little bit, we're going to start looking at slavery itself and looking at some of the things that, slave owners would have liked to have kept more quiet about slavery. But the truth of it, that people like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and others could bring to it, could bring to the conversation about that. And then we'll look at how white Southerners responded to all those things. So that's as far as we're going to go with that today. Any questions on that? There's more to that section, but we'll start covering it tomorrow.